All right. So that song, There's Another in the Water, kind of makes me, think about what that really means about like going through storms in life. Because we live in a world where we experience loss and pain. So I want to ask you tonight, have you ever lost someone close to you? Maybe a parent, grandparent, close friend. Or maybe you've experienced loss in the form of your parents are getting a divorce. Or maybe someone close to you has just been diagnosed with cancer. And no matter who you are, losing someone close to you or experiencing loss in these other ways hurts. So, how are we as Christians supposed to deal with this? How are we supposed to deal with this grief? Well, tonight, as we wrap up our series on the greatest hits of Matthew's gospel, I want us to look at probably two of the best known events in Jesus' life. That's two of his most famous miracles. If I asked you for two of Jesus' miracles, you would probably mention these: the feeding of the 5,000 and the walking on the water. And you might be wondering, okay, but how, those sound like pretty good miracles. Like, how does that relate to dealing with grief and problems? Well, we're going to look at those events in the context of what was actually happening in Jesus' life when he did them at the time. You might be surprised to realize that these two big, important miracles come at a time where Jesus was dealing with a great personal loss in his life. So tonight, we're going to look at Jesus as a model for how to deal with and respond to situations of grief and loss in our own lives. All right, so I'm going to walk us through most of Matthew 14, but we don't have time to cover everything, unfortunately. Tom won't let me. So a little bit of backstory to get us catapulted into what's going on here. At the beginning of Matthew 14, we read that John the Baptist has been put in prison for a while for speaking out against Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas was the Roman ruler of Galilee at the time. And we pick up the timeline that Herod has just put John the Baptist to death. He's had him beheaded while he was in prison. So let's pick up with Matthew 14 in verse 12. The words will be on the screen so you can follow along with me. John's disciples came and took his body and buried it. Then they went and told Jesus. When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. So when Jesus hears this news that John the Baptist has died, he seems very upset, doesn't he? Right? Because he tries to get himself alone, gets in a boat, and tries to go off by himself. But you may be wondering, if you're reading this for the first time, why? Why was Jesus so affected by hearing this? Well, we need to know a little bit about John the Baptist, right? You need to know, first off, and you probably know that he was a prophet. He was the first prophet to come to Israel in 400 years. And he was sent by God to prepare the way for the Messiah to come. And before Jesus actually starts his ministry, John the Baptist had a ministry of baptizing Jews to show their repentance from sin and thus their need for a spiritual Messiah, basically recognizing that being a Jew and following the law just simply wasn't enough to get them ready for the message that Jesus was going to present. But along with being a prophet, you need to know that John the Baptist was also Jesus' cousin. They were related. We learn in Luke chapter 1 that John's mother Elizabeth is the cousin of Jesus' mother Mary. And John is actually only 6 months older than Jesus was. And because they lived so close to each other in the same area, they most likely had grown up together. So Jesus here isn't just sad because a great prophet and preacher has died, right? He's mourning because he's lost a very close friend and relative who he'd known since birth. So this is most likely the greatest sorrow Jesus has experienced in his earthly life since losing his earthly father, Joseph, which we know about through context. So now that we have a bit of background on what's going on and why Jesus gets in a boat to go somewhere private, let's read on and see what happens. So picking up in verse 13. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. So at this time, Jesus was at the height of his popularity, and the other Gospels tell us that there were so many people around Jesus at this time coming and going that it was like a madhouse, right? But all Jesus wants to do is just to be alone with his closest friends, the disciples, and have some time to grieve the loss of his cousin. But the crowds saw that Jesus was going somewhere to be alone, and instead they run ahead, and by the time he gets off the boat, they're already there, right? And this is where people like maybe you and me would lose it, right? I mean, y'all, I need some space, right? Leave me alone. I just can't help you right now, right? I've got some things I need to take care of. But is that what we see Jesus do? No, instead of being frustrated and seeking to deal only with his own emotional needs, we see that Jesus sees the people and has compassion on them. You know, that's something that when you're going through a time of grief is very, very difficult for you to do. We stop seeing other people around us because we become so inwardly focused, so focused on our own needs that we don't even know what's going on with the people around us. But Jesus here recognizes that other people have needs too, and that he's the only one in this situation that can help meet those needs. I love how Mark's gospel records this. In Mark 6:34, it says that Jesus looked at these people like they were lost sheep without a shepherd, right? And so because of that, he starts to teach them. And he begins to minister to the crowd here. So let's read on in Matthew, jumping down to verse 15. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place, and it's already getting late, so send the crowds away so that they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food." Jesus replied, "They don't need to go away. You give them something to eat." So this is taken all day, right? Jesus tried to get alone, but instead he starts to preach and heal the sick in the crowd. And it's getting dark, right? And no one had brought food, and so it'd be really dangerous for them to go off by themselves. And even though Jesus wanted to be alone and grieve his cousin, because of his compassion, he still won't send the people away. And once again, unfortunately, we don't have time to go in depth on this wonderful miracle here, but the cliff notes are, Jesus takes 5 small rolls and 2 small fish and miraculously feeds this crowd that was counted at 5,000 men. And when you add in the number of women and children who would have been there too, but weren't included in the count, it's somewhere between 15 to 20,000 people Jesus miraculously feeds. So here we see, even in this time of great grief, Jesus ministers to the crowd, both to their physical needs by healing their sick, and then we see him feeding them miraculously, but also to their spiritual needs by teaching and preaching them, because those are the things that people need, help with both their physical and their spiritual problems. All right, so let's read on. Let's go down to verse 22 and see what happens next. So immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. After he dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. So after healing all the sick in the crowd and preaching for hours and hours, and then miraculously feeding them, Jesus finally gets this chance to be alone and deal with his grief, what he went off to do with in the first place. So then let's look here at Jesus' example and see what we can learn then about dealing with our own grief as we see Jesus. So first, I want you to look at what Jesus does first. The first thing he does is he goes to God in prayer. Right? Jesus isn't like our culture would say to do. He doesn't go to a doctor or a psychologist for some sort of human help. Although there's nothing wrong with going to a doctor for help, and there's certainly times where we might need this. But that's not where we see Jesus turn first, right? Jesus doesn't treat prayer like we sometimes do as like a last resort. Like, man, there's nothing else we can do, so I guess you got to pray, right? He also doesn't turn like we're tempted to in our culture to the wisdom of this world. Right? He doesn't turn to self-help books written without reference to God, or to mindfulness or meditation or manifestation and these positive feelings, all based in false Eastern religion and secular humanism. No, Jesus shows us that in our grief, in times of loss as Christians, we should first and continually take our grief directly to God. Right? Why? Because he's our maker. He's the one who knows what we are dealing with, what we are going through, and exactly what we need. Also, God is the only one who knows why this is happening and what the plan is. In Jesus' life at this time, part of John's death actually is ultimately to help facilitate the way that Jesus is going to die on the cross at the hands of the Romans, right? This had to happen for that to take place, and this put Jesus on Herod's radar and ultimately leads Jesus to the cross to die in the way that was prophesied. So these things happen for a reason. Second, look at what we can learn about God's view of people who are in need, right? We see that Jesus has compassion on the crowds, right? Jesus wants you to come to him in your grief. And actually, just a few chapters earlier in Matthew 8, Jesus directly tells us in Matthew 11, Matthew 11, verse 28. He says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." Jesus tells us that directly, to come to him with his problems. He isn't bothered by us. He isn't bothered by our needs and our wants. He has compassion on us, and that's what he longs to do, is for us to come to him in our time of need. Okay, but there's more to learn here, right? Next, we see Jesus actually illustrates what I was just talking about, actually illustrates God's response to us in our times of trouble, loss, pain, and grief. So let's read on, down to verse 23. Later that night, he, Jesus, was alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. So remember, Jesus had sent the disciples out to make a short journey across the shore to the near shore of the Sea of Galilee. And it should have been a really quick journey, but it suddenly goes sideways. You see, the Sea of Galilee was prone to sudden, extremely violent storms because it was located in this valley, right, surrounded by an extremely high mountain range. So if you know anything about how weather works, the cold, dry air on top of the mountains would randomly rush down and collide with the warm, wet air on the sea. And Ed Piotrowski will tell you that, thank you, that is a recipe for extremely violent weather. Now you need to remember also that the disciples were professional fishermen, most of them, right? Many of them had grown up fishing and navigating this exact same lake. So they would have known how to handle a boat. They would have known how to navigate storms. So that lets you know that this storm was so bad that even these professional fishermen couldn't deal with it, right? And according to John's account of what happened, they've been pushed off course nearly 4 miles at this point into the deep, rough waters in the middle of the lake. And they've been rowing and rowing against the wind and the waves for close to 9 hours with what should have been like a quick 30-minute trip across the. And let's briefly here look at Mark's account of what he says happens, because I love how he phrases it. In Mark 6, verse 47, this is what happens at this point. Later that night, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and he, Jesus, was alone on the land. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. This is really one of my favorite verses of the account of Jesus walking on the water. Because just like Jesus saw the crowds and had compassion on him, we say here Jesus sees the disciples. He's on land, right? He can't, they're 9 miles away. Physically, he doesn't see them. This is spiritual God, Jesus, seeing his friends, the disciples. His friends are in life-threatening trouble, and Jesus sees it. So in the storms of your life, whatever grief that you're facing right now, please know tonight, if you don't hear anything else, that Jesus sees you. He sees you in your grief. You may feel like no one else does. No one else knows. No one else cares what you're going through. But understand this, Jesus knows. He knows exactly what you're going through. But check it, Jesus didn't just see that the disciples were in trouble. He did something about it. So let's read on, verse 25. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. I would be too. "It's a ghost," they said, and they cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage. It's I. Don't be afraid." So Jesus didn't just see them, y'all. He came to them during their storm. While the storm was still happening, Jesus went to them. This is really interesting to me, because I think, like, if Jesus sees the storm, why didn't he just stop it right then? He could have, as soon as he saw what was going on, but he doesn't. Just like he could have stopped John, his cousin, from being put in prison. And he could have stopped John from being beheaded, but he doesn't. Why? Well, that begs the further question, if Jesus is in control, then why does he allow these storms to come into our lives in the first place? Why did he allow that person to die in your life? Why did he allow that bad thing that you're grieving right now to happen? Well, let's read on. We'll see the answer. Unfortunately, again, for time's sake, we're going to have to skip this really important event that happens next. Probably one of the coolest things about the walking on the water, where Peter actually gets out of the boat and walks on the water to Jesus very briefly in his faith, but then he takes his eyes off Jesus and starts to sink. There's all kinds of important things that we can talk about, and we'll probably talk about them later. But I want to focus here more on the actions of Jesus and what happens next. So skipping down to verse 32. And when they climbed into the boat, that's Peter and Jesus now, Jesus gets into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." So here we get the answer, y'all. Here we get the answer to why Jesus allowed this storm to happen in the first place. It's because Jesus needed to teach the disciples something. See, Jesus allows these storms into our lives so that we can learn from them. And the lesson seems to always be the same. It's to trust him, right? No matter what. Jesus says, believe in me. Call out for me. Keep your eyes on me, even in the storm. And he has to let these things happen to us or we'll never learn. Remember back to what we just read about where the disciples saw Jesus walking on the water, and they freaked out, and they thought it was a ghost. And I mean, we can cut them some slack, right? If you're out on a boat and someone comes walking on the water, it's probably a ghost, so freak out, right? But this was Jesus. But I'm surprised here a little bit because they knew, they had Jesus. They knew what was going on. They've seen him do miracles. He just fed 5,000 people. They were in the middle of a storm. You would think they would be like, Jesus, help us. But they were so surprised to see him because they weren't expecting him. They weren't looking for him. They were so preoccupied with the storm that they weren't even thinking about Jesus and going to him for help. Maybe you've done that same thing. See, they had forgotten actually an earlier lesson. This is not the first time this has happened. In Matthew 8, we don't have time to look at it, but in Matthew 8, they were caught in a storm on the same Sea of Galilee. This time Jesus was in the boat. They were almost going to die. Jesus was asleep. But then once they realized, oh, maybe we should go to Jesus, they wake him up and he immediately calms the storm. So they had forgotten that Jesus can do these things. The disciples were still building their faith, and Jesus knew that, so he had to let them go through this hardship. He lets you go through a hardship in life as much as he needs you to so that you can really learn to trust him. Here, Jesus wants the disciples to really, truly know who he is and what he has power over. And at this time, when they see Jesus walking on the water, and then they see him get into the boat and calm the storm once again, they start to get it. Look again at verse 33 and what Matthew says the disciples do when Jesus gets in the boat and calms the storm. It says they worshiped him and proclaimed, "Truly, you are the Son of God." And you may be like, okay, cool, the disciples knew that already. No, they didn't. This is actually the first time in Matthew's account of Jesus' life that the disciples recognized Jesus for his divinity. For the first time recorded, they actually declared Jesus is God, and for the first time it's recorded in Matthew that they worship him. That's what Jesus was trying to teach the disciples here through the storm, who he really was and what he could do for them. So as I start to wrap up, Tillman, come on up. Remember that as you walk through this life, storms will come. You will experience pain and loss. But as you deal with the grief and the pain that comes, follow Jesus' example. Go to God in prayer first. Don't wait. Before you try to solve it yourself or you seek human answers to your problem, go to God. So what storm are you going through tonight? I encourage you tonight, bring it to Jesus. Don't see prayer as a last resort. It's your first resort. It's your only resort. And then follow Jesus' example as you walk through this time of pain and grief. Don't be so inwardly focused, right? Looking so much to your own needs that you forget about the work that he's given you. He doesn't want you to stop. Remember, Jesus had compassion on the needs of others even as he was dealing with his pain. And as you walk through whatever storms come up in this life, remember that just like the disciples in the midst of their storm, Jesus sees you. He knows what you're going through. He's the only one who knows why you're going through it. Remember that he is in control tonight. And this is all happening so that you can learn something more about him. All right, let's pray.